Okay, and hello everyone, and welcome to this latest edition of the Games Monster podcast. Yes, this is the gaming podcast from Extreme Improv, Extremed, so do make sure wherever you're listening to this that you smash a subscribe button of some description. So you may be listening to this on your favourite podcast platform such as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, etc., Google Podcast, or you may be listening to it on the YouTube channel, which is the Extreme Improv Extremed YouTube channel. So head over to youtube.com/Extreme Improv and smash that subscribe button, and that will help a lot. So, the Nintendo 64. Wow. 25 years old this week. It seems... Well, it doesn't seem like yesterday, but in another sense it does seem like yesterday. I probably have the fondest memories from my time being a gamer, playing at the Nintendo 64 and being excited about the Nintendo 64. It felt like the first console when I was growing up where I was really there for it. So when I was a bit younger, like my family, we didn't have like games machines from when I was incredibly little. And when I say that, look, I may have been like 8 or 9, but there were kids at school that had already got games machines. They'd already got Mega Drives and Super Nintendos, Master Systems. First thing we had was an Amiga, and Amiga was a little bit out of fashion by the time we had it. And then by the time I got on the Super Nintendo bandwagon, it was, I think, 1995. So considering it came out like 4 years earlier than that, maybe 3 years earlier than that in the UK, I was late to the party. But the Nintendo 64 was the first console where I was like, yes, I need this. I need this day one. Now, fortunately for me, I didn't get it day one. My birthday comes in June, and the Nintendo 64 first came out in March. And if anyone in the UK will remember who was around back then, when it first came out, it was £250. And by the time June came along, it had been dropped by £100, because clearly it wasn't selling well enough. And Nintendo decided, look, we need to do what we can, because this PlayStation thing is selling really well. And so because of that, the Nintendo 64 had a big price drop just in time for my birthday, and I was not complaining about that, because it meant that I got the Nintendo 64 and I got Super Mario 64, which is a game I would go into the shops. Like, I remember everyone in my family was like just wowed by the graphics by it. I'd like go up and I'd have this strange 3-pronged controller, and it'd got a stick in the middle, and you'd go up to like paintings and they'd wobble like the surface of water, and it was just like the most unbelievable thing. You'd pick up these little like brochures, these little preview magazines about all the Nintendo 64 games, and to this day I can't throw them out. Like, I've got 1 or 2 or maybe 3 or 4 that they released throughout the Nintendo 64's lifespan, but there was 1 or 2 that they released within the first year of the Nintendo 64, and that first one, I'd flick through the pages, look at the different screenshots of the different games. Super Mario 64, I think it was even still being called Yoshi's Island 64 at that stage. Paper Mario, even though it didn't come out for years, they were showing it and calling it Super Mario RPG 2. They showed off GoldenEye, and no one knew how big a game that would be. Showed off Killer Instinct Gold, and I think it even had Kirby's Air Ride in there. But all the excitement, just seeing these big games that were going to be coming out for the Nintendo 64, like, I had to have it. And the first game, as I mentioned, that I got was Super Mario 64. And what an incredible experience. Like, I think that game has held up, I would say, arguably better than any other 3D game from like that era. And there's no other game which you can go back and play and it's still just as much fun. The controls, they absolutely nailed. Now, some people could say that the camera angles, like the camera system wasn't perfect, and yeah, it's true, it wasn't perfect, but it was as near as you could get to perfect, so that you could still absolutely play the game. There was never a point where it's like, oh, I can't adjust the camera to be able to play this well. But the Nintendo 64 so many classic games. It didn't do as well as the PlayStation, obviously. The PlayStation ended up selling, I think, 100 plus million consoles worldwide. The Nintendo 64, I think it topped out at 28 million, and that's obviously, it's not even close. It's like a third, less than a third of what the PlayStation did. And everyone will say that the history of the Nintendo 64, the fact that Nintendo decided to stay on cartridges rather than on CDs, was the main factor. There was probably a few factors. Obviously, the Nintendo 64, by the time it came out in the UK, it was March 1st, 1997. When you consider that it came out in June 1996 in Japan, and that the PlayStation had come out, I think, in 1995, and the Sega Saturn came out in 1994. Maybe the PlayStation even came out in 1994, in fact. But the fact that it was literally 2 years behind the competition. So people, they didn't wait around. They wanted a machine. They got on board the PlayStation. Other people had the PlayStation. It meant that their friends had got the PlayStation. So they could swap games. They could play multiplayer games. They could see what their friends were playing and wanted to also get in on the action. So they too bought a PlayStation. The PlayStation being on CD meant that it was cheaper to produce games, because it wasn't, you could sell games for like $39.99, whereas games on the Nintendo 64, when they'd come out in the UK, Super Mario 64 was $59.99. And I remember when they dropped things to $49.99, it's like, well, you're closing the gap, but it wasn't long before PlayStation games became $29.99. So you'd get the same game like WWF Attitude, and you'd be like, well, there's no load times on the Nintendo 64, and the graphics might be a bit better, but the PlayStation has the video cutscenes, and also it's £20 cheaper. So there was plus and minuses. I think if the Nintendo 64 had been a CD-based console and had come out at the same time, within the same time frame as the Sega Saturn and the PlayStation, that so many more people would have bought the Nintendo 64 than they did. And developers would have made more games for it, and there wouldn't have been the drought of games, because this was one of the things, like, when the Nintendo 64 launched, what were the launch games? There was Super Mario 64, Wave Race 64, Pilot Wings 64, and then I think literally 3 days later, at least in the UK, which is obviously I can comment on, Turok Dinosaur Hunter came out. And it's like, that's 3 games at launch, and another game stupidly a couple of days later, because why couldn't it make it to launch as well? Did they think that people were going to, that the smart people, did like the people at the developers of Turok, did they think like, look, after 3 days people will be done with Mario 64, now they're going to want Turok, and go out and buy it 3 days later? No, they should have got people whilst they were at the shop to pick up Turok. But Turok did really well. It's a good game. I would say that Turok 2, Turok 3, Turok Rage Wars in particular is my favourite of that series. But they were all good, and they were a big series on the N64 era. And when it became non-Nintendo exclusive on like the GameCube era, I think that really harmed it. Just because it felt like Team Nintendo felt like they'd been betrayed by one of their own. So, with this, let's take a look. What else was in the early launch of the Nintendo 64? Within the first few months, like I said, there was a drought. We did eventually get something like Mario Kart 64. We got Star Fox 64, which in the UK was Lilac Wars, and that came with the Rumble Pack, which was the first of its kind. And the Nintendo 64 just didn't have the filler. It had the big games. It had Mario Kart. Eventually, then it would, like, in the build up to Christmas 1997, it would have Diddy Kong Racing, it would have GoldenEye, and it may have actually been better in the UK than, say, the US. Now, I can't 100% say about Japan, because I know that they'd have things that only came out there. But in the US, imagine if this thing came out in 1996. Now, they would have still had to have waited until like late 1997 for GoldenEye, for Diddy Kong Racing. They would have already had Mario 64, but if they had to we were playing catch up in the UK, so it probably felt a little bit better that we were getting things a little bit more rapidly. But in the US, I can see that probably the drought was a real thing. But that's where Nintendo came up with the idea of saying quality over quantity. Quality over quantity. And, you know, one of the early games that they showed off for it was Cruising USA, and that took forever to eventually come out. It wasn't seen as good as the arcade game when it did come out, but eventually it got there. But that was like one of the big ones of like, this is what the Nintendo 64 can do, and then the game was actually different. Same with Killer Instinct, and like Killer Instinct 2 or whatever may have even had the Nintendo 64 logo on the arcade machine when on the graphics in the game. But eventually Killer Instinct Gold came out, and by the time that came out we were playing things like Tekken, Virtua Fighter, and so this Donkey Kong Country Killer Instinct 1 style pre-rendered 2D graphics, it didn't quite do it for people, even though it was still a very good game. But like Nintendo, they had a little bit of a lack of some of the more adult games, and this is where Nintendo started being accused of being like kiddie games with Mario, especially something like Yoshi's Story did them no favours on that front. But let's not worry so much about what they did wrong. Let's talk about some of what they did right, because obviously there was loads and loads of absolutely iconic games for the Nintendo 64. Now, I'll bring up a list here, so I'll go over them rather than chronologically. I'll go over them. Shame I can't bring up the chronological list, but I'll go over some of them like alphabetically. So, 1080 Snowboarding, great game. Simulation based, which I found it harder to play than something like Cool Borders on the PlayStation, Steep Slope Sliders on the Saturn. Obviously, we got Snowboard Kids on the N64, which was a lot more Mario Kart-like. But people did look at 1080 Snowboarding and saying, yeah, this is the serious sports simulation game on the N64. It's a shame that it didn't get a sequel until the GameCube, because obviously PlayStation, they were pumping out annual sequels, which was again something else which they could do that Nintendo couldn't. Whereas we got Super Mario 64, PlayStation got Crash Bandicoot, Crash 2, Crash 3. And it's like, well, if we could have had a Mario each year, then probably a lot more people had Nintendo 64s than actually sold. And I know that sounds a bit backwards, but I think people played Mario 64 and they were like, this is great. But then a year later, they're seeing their friends with Crash 1, 2, and 3, Spyro the Dragon 1, 2, and 3, and they're like, you know what? I'm going to sell my N64. I love it, but it's only so many times I can replay Mario 64. So I think probably each Nintendo 64 was probably sold to 2 or 3 people during its lifetime. Now, obviously, I kept my Nintendo 64 and I never sold it, but there will be people that would have just had it and felt like, well, this isn't producing multiple hits of the same franchise, so once I'm done with the franchise with its one game, then I'm done. Curiously though, it did get 2 Zeldas, and to me it always felt like, well, surely Super Mario is a tougher game, an easier game to just whack out like sequels than Zelda, because you think of Zelda on the NES, and Super Mario Brothers on the NES. Literally, Super Mario Brothers 2, like as we call it, the Lost Levels edition. It was just more of the same, but just harder, just different design. Like, people can make Super Mario Maker levels in a few minutes. Now, obviously, they're not going to be necessarily perfect, but you can make Super Mario levels. As long as they're different, as long as they give you a few minutes challenge per level, then you've done it. But you don't have Legend of Zelda Maker, and just plotting out what items, what dungeons, the layout of dungeons, the overworld, the clues, and everything. To me, it seems like Zelda is a much more complex and complicated game to make than Super Mario. When you think of Super Mario World, same deal. When you look at how complex Zelda: A Link to the Past became on the Super Nintendo, clearly it should have been that they could have put out a lot more Mario games than they did Zelda games. But even then, they put out, on the Super Nintendo generation, Mario World, then obviously Yoshi's Island, whereas we got one Zelda, but still not much in way of Mario. When it came to the N64, we only got Super Mario 64. The planned sequel to it didn't come out. Super Mario 64 2 was announced basically by the time Super Mario 64 came out, but we never got the sequel. And whatever they said they were working on for Super Mario 64 2, they said, oh, well, that isn't quite Super Mario Sunshine on the GameCube, so who knows what Super Mario 64 2 properly was. Then, though, we got Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, which I will speak a bit more about in a moment, and we got Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. Now, by the time Majora's Mask came out in late 2000, you think this thing came out in 1996 in Japan. By the time we got Majora's Mask, the writing was very much on the wall for the Nintendo 64. It lasted a little bit into 2001, but we all knew that the GameCube was coming the next year. And again, Europe being Europe, we didn't get the GameCube till 2002 because they always left us very much behind, which doesn't happen nowadays. And it's weird just because this is one of the things in Europe, the Nintendo 64, the Super Nintendo, the NES, they didn't do well compared to Sega, and they didn't do well compared to PlayStation. It's because we were always an afterthought. And Europe's a big place, but we were the afterthought, and that probably would have helped Nintendo's fortunes here, but it took them many years to get their business in order, which when you think of what a global business Nintendo is now, that's still, in the time of the N64 and GameCube, they hadn't really got things figured out enough. But anyway, let's see. I said about 1080 snowboarding. Let's see what else we've got here. Just share some memories. I could do a dozen retrospectives on the N64, and I could do individual retrospectives on all of the individual games, and I'm sure at some point I will. But let me know in the comments. Let me know on Extremes.tv's website. Let me know on the Extreme Improv Facebook page or the Geek Battle Facebook group. Anywhere where this, you can get a message to me. Let me know what you like and what you'd like to see covered in future episodes. Look at this. There's so many games. Army Men, Air Combat, Army Men, Sarge's Heroes, Army Men, Sarge's Heroes 2. It's like I didn't play any of those games. What else we got here, though? Banjo-Kazooie, Banjo-Tooie. So let's speak about Rare for a second. Rare became a second-party developer for Nintendo during the Super Nintendo era. Obviously, Donkey Kong Country, they were making a new Donkey Kong game for Nintendo, and we got Killer Instinct. But then Rare, basically, deserve a gold medal, and it's such a shame that in the GameCube era, everything quickly went wrong between Nintendo and Rare, because they were the dream team during the N64's lifespan. Because whereas other third-party developers weren't making games for Nintendo, so there weren't all of the cross-platform games. Not everything that came out on the PlayStation or Saturn came out on the N64. But Nintendo 64 owners were like, yeah, but we've got Rare. And all of the Rare games are exclusive, and there were so many Rare games during the life of the N64. I'm not going to be able to go through the list to be able to reel them all off, so I might forget something. But off the top of my head, what did you get? You got Blast Corps, which was a very fun game. Not the perfect game, but the concept, it feels like, my god, there needs to be a sequel to Blast Corps now that Rare are owned by Xbox, by Microsoft. This would be a fantastic game for Xbox, and I can't imagine how incredible and cinematic it would be these days. But you would use a variety of vehicles to destroy a path so that a vehicle that's gone out of control on its own with a nuclear bomb on it is just continually going in a straight line. You have to stop it. It's like the movie It Follows, but with a nuke, and that shows you how cool an idea that is. But there was Blast Corps, there was Killer Instinct Gold. Like I said, great follow-up to Killer Instinct on the Super Nintendo, but just not seen as all that compared to all of the 3D games, Virtua Fighter, Tekken, that we were getting on other consoles at the time. And it's amazing, there's almost no 2D games on the Nintendo 64. You got Mischief Makers, Yoshi's Story, Killer Instinct, Gold, and maybe there's going to be one or two others, Rakuga Kids or something like that. It's 2D beat 'em up, but almost no 2D games on the N64. Because everything was going 3D, and now you get 2D, you get 3D. As long as they're good games, people enjoy it. But back to Rare. Then I think we got GoldenEye. Then we got Diddy Kong Racing. Now, obviously, let's not brush over these. Let's talk about them here. GoldenEye, revolutionary game. I think it might be the second best-selling game on the N64, only beaten by Super Mario 64. And it's just an extraordinary game. So, GoldenEye is still the benchmark for if you're going to turn a movie into a video game, they're trying to be as good as GoldenEye. GoldenEye is just like a masterpiece of when it came out, the atmosphere. It wasn't like Doom, it wasn't like Quake. You would use stealth. This like predated Metal Gear Solid. It was like, okay, you have to be stealthy. You have to, you could, I think, use darts to shoot your enemies rather than just kill them outright. There was like lots of things you could do which weren't being done in games up to that point, and it was just, 1 second. Sorry, getting messages pop up. But anyway, there was 1 second. Let's just close it down. It's in my way. So there was this cinematic vibe to it. It was like it got like the likeness of the actual cast. If they could have, they would have had the likeness of the other James Bonds in it. But it turned out that wasn't cleared. But you could actually use like a Game Shark, Game Genie to get it back into the game. And the fact that it got like the different difficulty levels where it'd give you different missions, it was quite like Super Mario 64 in that it wouldn't just be get to the end of the level. It'd be, right, you've got these goals to complete the level. And games before the N64 era with Super Mario 64, with GoldenEye, they wouldn't do that. And even GoldenEye took it another step forward, because on Super Mario 64 it'd be like, right, you've got this big 3D area, rather than just waste this space by just running to the end, we'll put on like 6 or 7 different challenges in this area. And you do one of them, you get a star, and that'd be it. GoldenEye, it'd be like, right, you're on agent difficulty level, so just get to the end and maybe like unlock this computer code or something like this. But then it'd be like on special agent, it'd be like, right, get to the end, unlock the computer code, but also rescue this person. And then there'd be 00 agent level, which was like the hardest one. And it'd be do all of the above, but also you need to hack into this mainframe and plant this bomb, and you need to plant a bug on this person as well, and there'd be all these extra challenges. And the multiplayer, which incredibly was almost not included, was somewhat of an afterthought, was the thing that so many people couch co-op. There were 4 ports on the N64, which was the first, I believe, or at least the first mainstream system that did really well. That had 4 ports on it, so you could plug in 4 controllers, and you'd have 4 friends sat round together playing GoldenEye Deathmatch, and it was just absolutely mind-blowingly brilliant. But what else did I say? Diddy Kong Racing. Oh my god, that's so much fun. So one of the things with Rare, and we'll speak about Banjo-Kazooie in a moment, is they would sort of see what Nintendo do, and they'd be like, anything you can do, we can do better. And what they would do is they'd look at Donkey Kong Country, and they'd say, they'd look at Super Mario World and say like, yeah, okay, we can make this look better. We can make it play better. We can make it a better game, which is funnier, and people are going to remember more. And they made Donkey Kong Country. Now, it's subjective if you prefer Super Mario World or Donkey Kong Country. But you could clearly see, look, riding Yoshi, riding Rambi. Platform, they took the formula of Super Mario World and they tried to better it with Donkey Kong Country. They took the formula of Super Mario 64 and they put out Banjo-Kazooie. The formula is incredibly similar, and arguably it's a better looking game. It came out afterwards, they've got that time benefit, but also, is it a better playing game? Is it a tighter game? Has it got better moves? It's what Rare were all about. They took what Nintendo did, and if we weren't going to get Super Mario 64 2, there would be one saying, look, don't worry, we're going to give you Banjo-Kazooie. They took Mario Kart, Super Mario Kart or Mario Kart 64, and they're like, yeah, well, we're going to combine this with Super Mario 64, and we're going to make Diddy Kong Racing. It's going to look better. It's going to have more stages. And also, we're going to take the hub world and story mode from Super Mario 64, and we're going to combine it into Mario Kart and call it Diddy Kong Racing. Diddy Kong Racing, I think, perhaps isn't quite as pick up and playable as Mario Kart 64 these days. But at the time, I was like, this is so much better. It's like it's a bigger game. You could get into it. There was characters to unlock. It was just absolutely brilliant game to play at the time. But then, continuing on with Rare, and I might not be doing things all in the correct order here, but let's have a look. What else did Rare put out? So Banjo-Kazooie, Banjo-Tooie. Now, they showed roughly at the same time. And this may have even been in that first preview magazine I got before the N64 came out. As well as Banjo-Kazooie, they showed off Conker's Quest, which eventually was one of the final games to come out for the N64. Because they were like, well, look, Conker's Quest is coming out and it's just basically the same thing as Banjo-Kazooie, as Super Mario 64. People are already saying that all of the Nintendo games are kiddie. And they were like, well, screw this, South Park is a thing. We're going to make Filthy Conker, Filthy Mouth. Like, you do a Wii on demons to put out their fiery flames. You'll bounce on the boobs of, like, a sunflower. What else would you do in that game? You'd get drunk, you'd vomit. There was singing, Great Mighty Poos. It was just absolutely Rare. Like, maybe they were like, yeah, we're not going to stay with Nintendo forever. We're just going to push the boundaries as much as we can and put out, like, the rudest game, which is the least Nintendo-style game, rebellious-like, and then we're going to go to Microsoft in a year's time anyway. And you know what? That's what they did. Who knows if there was any sort of rebellion in there? But anyway, moving on. What else did Rare put out? So Conker, we got Banjo-Tooie later on. Nowhere near as good as the original. Banjo-Kazooie, so much fun, tight levels, but Rare just were like, we're going to make everything bigger every time. And they went too far. Donkey Kong 64 was great, but it took me months to complete it. There was one level in particular, one banana that you'd collect, which was just extraordinarily hard. I think it was like where there was like underwater and there was like a giant fan or something, and it took me literally months to beat that one. I don't know why I sucked at it. Nowadays, I'm sure you could just look up a player's guide, watch a YouTube Let's Play, and see how to do it. And I may play it because I've got Donkey Kong 64 on the Wii U. But just like with some games on the Wii U, people say about like the controls on the N64 games feel slightly off. And I experienced that on Donkey Kong 64, but I never read that anyone else did. But to me, it didn't feel quite right. But maybe I'll get to it at some point again. But Donkey Kong 64 was a lot of fun. It wasn't better than Mario 64 for me. Graphics were good. Like the levels and the world was good. The fact it needed the expansion pack, so, oh my god, this is going to be the biggest thing ever, and it was a huge game, but arguably it was just too big. 5 Kongs to play as, you couldn't pick up the bananas and collectibles for the other Kongs as the Kong that you were playing as at the time, which meant that it was just like, well, they're really stretching this game out. It doesn't need to be this long, it's artificially long, which was a shame, but then Banjo-Tooie took it even further, and they'd have it so, whereas in Banjo-Kazooie, you'd learn new moves as you go along, and sometimes you'd have to go back to old levels once you learn a new move. And that was the same on Super Mario 64. It's like, oh, you don't have the wing cap to be able to fly yet. You don't have the Metal Mario cap, and you'd have to go back. But they were just like a little thing. Banjo-Kazooie, you'd learn new moves, and then there'd be select jiggies that you'd get that you'd have to go back, and it's like, now I can get that, and that would feel great. But then Donkey Kong 64, like I said, you'd play as Donkey, Diddy, you'd have Chunky and Lanky and Tiny Kong, and you'd have to play as each of them individually to be able to do certain things. And then on levels you'd find an animal buddy, like Rambi or whatever, we can only do this bit if I've got Rambi. But Banjo-Kazooie, it's like, whereas you were just Banjo with Kazooie all the time in the original, you were like, now you can play as Banjo and Kazooie. Now you can play as Banjo. Now you can play as Kazooie. Now you can play as Mumbo Jumbo. I don't think you can play as Tooty, but I haven't played this in many years to remember. But it was just overly complicated. And like sometimes it'd be like, well, to get this Jiggy, you have to go into a different level. And it's like, how can you even figure that out? It's like, okay, how many Jiggies have I got on this level? Okay, I've got 4. Oh, there's the next one. No, I have to be in a different level to be able to get this one in this level. And the levels will interconnect. It's like, it's like trying to remember the underground map of London off the top of your head. It was too hard. So anyway, that was Banjo-Tooie, Banjo-Kazooie. I mentioned about Donkey Kong 64. These are all great games. Rare were the absolute masters. Jet Force Gemini was one that I never got along with, though. Didn't get along with Jet Force Gemini, and I do actually feel, like I said, the Rare games, with Banjo-Tooie, they kind of lost their way for me a little bit. They went mad with power of how elaborate can we make the games, because like GoldenEye, Diddy Kong Racing, Banjo-Kazooie, all fantastic. When it came out, I was like, Donkey Kong Country, this is fantastic. In retrospect, I can see flaws with it, but then Banjo-Kazooie wasn't as good. Mickey's Speedway USA wasn't as good as Diddy Kong Racing, and it should have been a sequel to Diddy Kong Racing, but done even better. But instead, they did Mickey Speedway USA. It wasn't as good. Jet Force Gemini for me wasn't quite as good. Well, I didn't get into it, rather. Perfect Dark. They had the opportunity to make the James Bond follow-up, and they didn't. And to me, that's crazy that they didn't take that opportunity. It would have sold so much more. Instead, once again, it's like we're going to use the expansion pack for Perfect Dark because we're going to make this game as elaborate as we can, but it'll also mean that lots of people won't be able to play it because they don't have the expansion pack. And yeah, you could do some modes on it without the expansion pack, but you couldn't get the full game, and I think that affected it. It also came out in an era like the year 2000, so if it had come out sooner, it would have helped things more, but I think a lot of people had moved on. They were getting into PlayStation. The Dreamcast was now a thing. It was like the year that the PS2 was coming out as well. So, I think Rare lost their way. Conker's Bad Fur Day, short game, hilarious, plays great, and I think it's because they put in so much speech that they had to make the game shorter, just because they were filling up the cartridge with so much speech. And also they'd restarted it from Conker's Quest to 12 Tales Conker 64 to Conker's Bad Fur Day. Nintendo wouldn't even publish it themselves. I think in the end they were like, look, let's just get this thing out here because we'll probably never be able to put out a game like this again. And guess what? Other than the remake of Conker's Bad Fur Day on the Xbox, they've never put out a game like that again. But anyway, let's have a look what else there was on the N64. I'm going to have to do a part 2 of this. I'm definitely going to have to do a part 2. If you haven't heard it already, I did a Sonic the Hedgehog retrospective because that was 30 years old this week. And I did Sonic the Hedgehog looking at all of the platform games. Then I did a part 2 looking at all the racing games, sports titles, and other spin-offs. They're all in the archive on the Games Monster podcast, so just check that out. But let's have a look. We'll cover a few other things, like... And I think probably we'll do some retrospectives on individual games coming up as well. Maybe we'll do an N64 season. But let's see, Clay Fighter 63 and a third. What a random one to pick out here, but it's just because I'm looking at things alphabetically. Notoriously bad game. Notoriously bad game. Clay Fighter 63 and a third. Now, I remember the original Clay Fighter on the Super Nintendo, and maybe even Clay Fighter 2. But Clay Fighter, for me, it's like, oh my god, this looks so much fun, because it was like claymation. And it was like digitized graphics like you get on Mortal Kombat, but obviously digitized graphics of clay made it look like early CGI. Whereas nowadays they're just CGI everything, but these were clay, photographed, and so it looked like these cool CGI cartoon characters coming to life and fighting, and I liked it on the Super Nintendo. Now the Nintendo 64 game, people say yeah, it wasn't very good. Now they did put out Clay Fighter's Sculptor's Cut to try and be a better version of it, but people said that yeah, this is a very bad game. People would say that it was actually the worst game on the N64, and that's debatable. But the Sculptor's Cut is an incredibly rare game because I think it only came out like Blockbuster Video or something. Not even sure if you could get it at in the UK. I'm not sure off the top of my head. I certainly never had it, but it was just really bad. People said, look, Killer Instinct much better, Street Fighter much better, Mortal Kombat much better, and now there are things like Tekken and Virtua Fighter. Why on earth do we have this Clay Fighter game? It wasn't seen as good, but I think there's still an affection for it all these years later. Let's see, what else did we have? Let's cover just one or two more, and then we'll do a part 2 later on. So Diddy Kong Racing we've covered. You'd get Disney tie-ins. You'd get things like Disney's Tarzan. I'm trying to remember if you get like Toy Story 3 on the N64. I'm not sure. Definitely on the Dreamcast. But you got Toy Story 2, Buzz Lightyear to the rescue. Oh, maybe, yeah, that's what I'm thinking of. And then Toy Story 3 was perhaps the next generation. Doom 64, let's talk about that. Now that's a game which has got like a second life recently because it's come out on everything. And it's interesting to me just because Doom 64, and yet they've put it onto like Xbox and PlayStation. And now obviously it's owned by Xbox, but the fact that you get a game with 64 in the title being released on other things, I think is quite cool. Because even like Zombie U, when it came out on other things, I think they just called it Zombie. I don't think they put the U after because that's obviously like the Wii U. But we're so far removed from the Nintendo 64. They just said, yeah, this is Doom 64. It's what we called it. It's what it is. But that was a good game. But once again, it's got new appreciation now just because Doom 64 at the time, it got like the 2D sprites. Like, you couldn't, I don't think, if I remember correct, even though I have played it like a year ago, I don't think you could look up and down. I don't think you could jump. It was still locked into the old Doom mechanics of the original Doom and Final Doom and Doom 2. But obviously it got the N64 style graphics. It was quite a dark game that I remember. But compared to the likes of Quake and compared to the likes of Duke Nukem 3D and GoldenEye, and when we got all these other things, Doom 64 seemed a little bit outdated. But it's still a good game, and once again, that was an era where people didn't appreciate that certain things were like, well, this may not be as modern as other things, but it's like still really good, or it's the most refined version of this thing that it could be. So like I said, 2D platformers completely went the wayside during the N64 era. Like Doom 64, stuff like that, Hexen, they weren't appreciated on the N64 in the face of something like GoldenEye. Yoshi's Story being like 2D, like I said, it was like, why isn't this 3D? Everything had to be 3D, and so things that weren't 3D, Street Fighter in that era, like had a real tough time, even though there was the Street Fighter X plus Alpha games in 3D. People were like, no, the new thing is Tekken. And some of the older things were left by the wayside. I'll speak more about this in part 2, but we never got the Nintendo 64 Metroid game. That skipped that generation. I think that was one of the only real notable games from the Nintendo roster that skipped that generation. We didn't get a N64 Metroid. If you look at Jet Force Gemini, and I don't know this is confirmed, this was either Rare saying, hey, well, we can do 3D Metroid, or maybe they were like, hey, will you let us do Metroid? I don't know. But you can see why there would be that thought there. Anyway, I'm going to bring this to a wrap-up for now. So, do make sure you subscribe to the Games Monster podcast on all major podcast platforms. If you really want to help, go over to youtube.com/Extreme Improv. Smash that subscribe button, guys. Go over to the website extreamed.tv, which is spelled XSTREAMED.tv. It's literally like the word streamed, like I did a live stream, STREAMED, streamed. This is extreamed.tv. And there's loads of articles. I've just put up articles reviewing things like the Loki TV series on Disney Plus, and that's really dated it. Speaking about the N64 from 25 years ago is actually a bit more timeless than talking about a TV show from this week. But just for the historical reference of when this came out, yeah, I talk about Loki. But I've also got things on the website listing the best Dreamcast games, ranking the Sega consoles, lots of gaming nostalgia, so do make sure you check it out. You'll also be able to find the information on the Extreme Improv Extremed World Championship, which is a short form improv, like Whose Lines It Anyway kind of thing, tournament that we'll be doing in July of this year. Find out details if you're a performer, if you would like to be one. There'll be workshops, there'll be shows, ways to get involved. Anyway, till next time, stay safe, always stay extremes, and keep on gaming, guys.